On the way to Damascus. Since the martyrdom of Stephen, the movement of persecution of all disciples and sympathizers of the way had worsened in Jerusalem. Saul of Tarsus was fascinated by suggestions of cruel fanaticism. The Tarsi young man who held a high position in the Sanhedrin was immersed in the sweet memories of his departed wife, until he is awakened from the memories when the friend Zacharias arrived who welcomed Abigail as a daughter. A long hug marked the meeting of friends, and Abigail was the subject of Saul's first interrogation. Zacharias answers him, "In vain we endeavor to restore the youth and the colors of youth, but the poor thing started to languish." But something happened that she was filled with profound consolations. A man named Ananias trained on our farm. Abigail found him and stopped listening to him for hours. When he said goodbye, Ananias gave him scrolls with the teachings of the carpenter from Nazareth. The accompanying pain turned into a comforting expression of intimate joy. Saul reflected. Why did he come across, in everything, traits of the humble carpenter from Nazareth, whom his willful spirit detested? Since the first controversy with Esteban in the Wave Church, she had never been able to go a day without meeting him. The irritated Tarsus doctor says, "Zachariah, why did you not prevent such contact? I have to find Ananias in order to properly punish him. The defense of the law of Moses is at stake." At the Sanhedrin, he interrogates a service assistant to find out Ananias' whereabouts. "Where does this carpenter adept reside? I do not know. When I met him, he lived in Jerusalem, where he taught the gospel. But Ananias had no landing. He came from Joppa, parking in several villages, where he preached the truth of Jesus Christ, until Saul got information that the gospel disciple went to take up residence in Damascus. With the license to act properly, Saul, with the company of 3 servants, fulfills all the preparations for a great trip to Damascus. After a few days, the small caravan moved from Jerusalem to the vast plain of Syria. On the eve of his arrival, almost at the end of his difficult and painful journey, Saul the Tarso felt the bitter memories that were constantly looming. Secret forces imposed profound questions on him. He reviewed the early dreams of youth. His soul unfolded in atrocious questions. The riddles of fate excited his mind. The mystery of pain and differential destinies riddled him with insoluble enigmas and dark questions. However, those adherents of the crucified carpenter boasted an unknown serenity. As much as his companions drew his attention to the first picture of Damascus, which were drawn in the distance, Saul was unable to have peace. The rabbi did not seem to see the resigned camels, who were crawling heavily under the burning sun at noon. Embald was invited to the meal. Pausing for minutes in a delightful little oasis, he waited for the companions' light meal to end and continue on, absorbed by the intensity of his inner thoughts. At a certain moment, however, when he had barely awakened from the anxious cogitations, he felt surrounded by lights different from the solar tonality. He has the impression that the air spits like a curtain, under invisible and powerful pressure. Intimately, he considers himself prey to unexpected vertigo after mental effort, persistent and painful. He wants to turn around, ask for help from his companions, but he does not see them. He cries out desperately to plead for help. "Jacob, Demetrius, help me!" But the confusion of the senses takes away the notion of balance and falls from the animal helplessly on the burning sand. Another light bathes his dazzled eyes, and on the way that the torn atmosphere reveals him, he sees the figure of a man of majestic beauty appear, giving him the impression that he was descending from the sky to meet him. His tunic was made of luminous points, his hair touched his shoulders, the Nazarene. His majestic eyes, imminent with sympathy and love, illuminating the grave and tender physiognomy where a divine sadness hung. The doctor of Tarsus looked at him with profound astonishment, and that was when, in an inflection of unforgettable voice, the stranger made himself heard. "Saulo, Saulo, why are you persecuting me?" The Tarsian boy did not know that he was instinctively on his knees, unable to define what was going on. He squeezed his heart in a desperate attitude. An inescapable feeling of veneration took over him entirely. What had happened? Whose divine figure could you see on the open firmament panel, and whose presence flooded his heart precipitated by unknown emotions? While the companions surrounded the young genuflex without hearing or seeing anything, despite noticing a great light overhead, Saul asked in a trembling and fearful voice, "Who are you, Lord?" A roll of balsamic light, and in a tone of inconceivable sweetness, the Lord replied, "I am Jesus." Now, before his eyes, he had that magnanimous and misunderstood Christ. The preachers of the way were not deluded. Estevan's word was pure truth. Abigail's belief was the real path. That was the Messiah. Yes, he, Saul, saw him there in the splendor of his divine glories. That was when he noticed that Jesus was approaching and looked at him affectionately. Saul says words to him that came from the core of his soul. "Sir, what do you want me to do?" That resolute soul, even in the trance of unconditional surrender, humiliated and wounded in its most esteemed principles, showed its nobility and loyalty, finding the greatest revelation in the face of the love that Jesus showed willingly. Saul the Tarsus does not choose tasks to serve him in the renewal of his efforts as a man. From Saul's encounter with Jesus in Damascus, he transformed himself to be the greatest promoter of early Christianity. He changed his name to Paul de Tarso, but the biggest change was the new direction of his life. taken by divine ideals. Now, Paul becomes the apostle to the Gentiles and wrote the sublime and enlightened letters. Map of the trips that Paul the Tarsus took where he spread the good news of Jesus. First trip, second trip, third trip, fourth Paul the Tarsus trip, where in Rome he ended his sublime mission on earth. Source: Book Paulo y Esteban by Chico Xavier, with spiritual authorship by Emmanuel.